For decades, Princess Anne was the Queen's steely shadow, loyal, unwavering, yet silent. But behind the curtain of duty lay a deeply personal bond, one the world never fully saw. Until now, what was truly shared between mother and daughter in their final conversation? And why did Anne wait so long to speak? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In the golden tapestry of the British monarchy, Princess Anne has always been a silent thread tightly woven, never fraying, and rarely noticed. To the world, she was the no-nonsense workhorse, the Princess Royal, who didn't chase headlines or court chaos. But what if beneath her stoic surface lay a lifetime of unsaid truths, silent sacrifices, and a loyalty so deep it blurred the lines between duty and daughterhood? For years, Anne remained in the Queen's shadow, not because she lacked presence, but because she embodied discretion. She needed to speak. She served. But in doing so, she witnessed everything. And now, as she finally opens up about that final moment with her mother, we're left to ask, what had always remained unsaid between them? Throughout their lives, Queen Elizabeth and Anne shared a relationship built more on mirrored temperament than tenderness. They were both hard-edged, reserved, driven by discipline rather than displays of affection. The Queen, conditioned by crown and country, never wore her heart on her sleeve, and Anne, she learned early that emotions had no place in a palace built on control. Yet, despite their distant exteriors, there were flickers, rare, fleeting glimpses of their private bond. A brush of the hand at royal engagements, exchanged glances during state visits, and whispers that behind the scenes, the Queen confided in Anne more than anyone else. She wasn't just her daughter, she was her anchor. But Anne's silence has always been her most potent statement. Even as tabloids dissected family scandals, she remained immovable. And that silence, over time, became a mystery of its own. What did she know? What had she witnessed in the royal corridors as Charles, Andrew, and even the Queen herself battled public storms? Only now, with her mother's absence, does Anne finally begin to let the veil lift, and what emerges isn't just grief, but years of quiet observation bursting into revelation. In her final days, the Queen's inner circle grew smaller. Doctors came and went, advisors whispered. But it was Anne who stood by her side, silent, watchful, steady. She wasn't just there out of duty. She was there because of something deeper. In those last quiet hours at Balmoral, Anne's presence wasn't ceremonial. It was intentional. As the Queen's breath grew shallower, as the end crept in like the slow descent of dusk, Anne knew something profound was approaching. Not just the loss of her mother, but the emergence of truths that had been locked away for decades. And then came the funeral. The world watched as Anne followed her mother's casket with that same unyielding expression. But look closer. Behind her eyes was something more. A flicker, a weight, a memory that refused to fade. Some said it was sorrow. Others said it was the burden of responsibility. But only Anne knew the truth. Because what she carried wasn't just grief. It was the memory of a final exchange that no one else would ever hear. Words that redefined their entire relationship, and in time, would shake the very foundations of the crown itself. But it wasn't just grief etched on Anne's face that day. It was the weight of a promise, one forged in a chilling final exchange that would haunt her soul. When whispers of the Queen's decline began, the palace machine spun into overdrive, but within the walls of Windsor, panic reigned. Who would be told? Who would be summoned? And why was Anne the first to arrive? The moment the Queen's physicians raised the red flag, royal protocol kicked in like clockwork. But behind the official statements and carefully curated updates, chaos was brewing. Advisors scrambled to decide who should be informed, in what order, and most importantly, what to say. The monarchy, built on centuries of control, suddenly found itself teetering on the edge of the unknown. But amid the clamour and confusion, one thing was clear. Anne was to be contacted first. Not Charles, not William Anne. And that decision wasn't a clerical formality. It was deliberate, chosen, for reasons buried deep in decades of trust and silence. The Queen's health had been failing quietly for months, but the full gravity hit the family like a thunderclap. Behind closed doors, tensions rose sharply. Medical advisors urged caution, pressing for discretion as rumors threatened to spiral. But as meetings stretched into the night and contingency plans were reviewed for the 100th time, Anne didn't hesitate. She boarded a flight to Balmoral immediately, alone. No security procession, no public fanfare, just urgency. Because she knew something the others didn't. This wasn't just a health scare. It was the endgame, and she wasn't going to let anyone else dictate the terms of her mother's final hours. Meanwhile, Charles and Camilla appeared to move with curious delay. While aides insisted they were preparing to travel, insiders whispered of strategic stalling. Camilla was said to be managing media optics. Charles reportedly demanded privacy, but Anne saw it differently. She sensed a looming power struggle. She felt it in every phone call not returned, in every vague message from the palace. The silence wasn't just strange, it was telling. Something was off, and Anne, known for her blunt instincts, began to suspect that this moment, this fragile window before the inevitable, was already being shaped by ambition rather than compassion. And then it came. A message passed discreetly through a senior aide. The Queen wishes to speak to Anne. Alone. Not Charles, not Edward, not even her husband, just Anne. That request, seemingly simple, sent shockwaves through the inner circle. Why her? Why now? What needed to be said in complete privacy, so close to the end? And why had the Queen, always careful, always guarded, chosen this moment to break with tradition and ask for her daughter, not her heir? Anne said nothing to anyone. She didn't ask questions. She simply walked into the room. What followed would forever change her, and what she carried out of that room would become the most closely guarded truth in modern royal history. That private request would ignite a storm. Anne never expected one final meeting that would force her to confront ghosts, loyalties, and royal betrayals. It was just the two of them, no cameras, no aides, no interruptions. What was exchanged in that room remains one of the monarchy's most closely guarded mysteries. Until now. Anne finally reveals what her mother said, and what she didn't. The door closed with a soft but final click, sealing off the world that had always watched them from the outside. Anne stood at the threshold, suddenly aware that this moment, this fragile pocket of time, was unlike any she had ever experienced. The Queen, once towering in presence even in silence, now lay fragile and pale, yet her gaze remained sharp. The room was quiet, not in the ceremonial sense, but in that eerie stillness that only surrounds the dying. Anne wasn't prepared, not for the weight, not for the intimacy, and certainly not for the reckoning that was about to unfold. Her mind, always structured, always measured, began to blur as emotions she'd buried for decades clawed their way to the surface. She wasn't just a princess in that room. She was a daughter facing the last heartbeat of a bond defined by silence. The Queen, though visibly fading, spoke with a voice that defied her condition, frail, yes, but laced with unmistakable command. "You've always known, haven't you?" she asked. Anne didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because, yes, she had always known. Known the truths no one dared speak. Known the choices made in shadows. Known the burdens passed from sovereign to sovereign like cursed heirlooms. What followed wasn't a conversation. It was a confession. The Queen, always a master of control, allowed herself to unravel. She spoke of legacy, not as triumph, but as weight. She called the crown both a shield and a chain. She admitted she had made decisions that haunted her. And then came the words that shattered Anne's breath. "I trusted the wrong son." Anne's heart slammed against her ribs. It wasn't just a confession, it was a judgment. Not a mother's reflection, but a monarch's reckoning. The Queen spoke of missed chances, ignored instincts, and the gnawing fear that everything she'd built might crumble under the weight of what she left behind. There was no name mentioned, but the implication hung heavy. Anne felt the fault lines cracking beneath her. She had fought so hard to uphold the image, to protect the crown. But now, the very foundation she had defended was being condemned by the woman who built it. Anne didn't weep. She didn't protest. She stood, torn between duty and devastation. She wanted to scream, to ask why these truths were withheld until the 11th hour. But she didn't, because she was the Queen's daughter, and she was also the Queen's soldier. And soldiers don't flinch. Instead, she asked only one question: "What do you want me to do?" She reached instead for Anne's hand, a gesture so rare it startled her. "Tell them what matters," the Queen whispered. "When the time comes, you'll know." And just like that, it was done. No crown, no protocol, just two women, one departing, one forever changed. But Anne's revelation didn't bring peace. It unraveled a truth that would fracture the royal foundation from the inside. For 70 years, the Queen was the face of unwavering resolve. But what if her final confession to Anne was one of deep regret? A moment of doubt that questioned her entire reign. As the silence between them settled into something heavier than grief, the Queen's voice dropped to a near whisper. But the words that followed landed like thunder. "There is one choice I would undo," she said. Anne's breath caught in her throat. In a life ruled by duty, precision, and deliberate silence, the Queen had never uttered anything resembling regret. And now, with time running out, she was pulling back the curtain on the one thing she could never make right. It wasn't a policy or a war, or even a scandal, it was personal. She didn't name names, but what she did say was chilling. "A child who never became what I hoped." The ambiguity was razor sharp, and it cut straight into Anne's heart. The room seemed to spin with unspoken possibilities. Anne wanted to ask was, Charles? Was it Andrew? Or was it her? The Queen had raised 4 children, each flawed, each shaped by the burden of their birthright. But this wasn't about titles or succession. This was about legacy. Anne's mind raced. If it was Charles, then the implication was damning, a future king whom his own mother saw as her greatest misstep. If it was Andrew, the silence around his scandals suddenly made sense. And if it was Anne, then every year of loyalty, every swallowed opinion, every moment she stood in the Queen's shadow had been in vain. The ambiguity was torture, and the Queen gave no further clarification. She didn't need to. The wound had already been inflicted. Anne's expression didn't break, but inside she was reeling. This was the woman who had taught her to never cry in public, to never let the world see weakness, and yet here she was, unraveling before her. A monarch who had reigned with iron will, now staring into the void of her own mistakes. "I kept it, all together," the Queen murmured, "but I'm not sure what I've left behind can stand without me." It wasn't just fear. It was guilt. She had built an empire of image. But now, as she approached the end, she realized the image might not survive her. She saw cracks Anne had always seen, but was never allowed to speak of. That secret, the Queen's final burden, was now Anne's to carry. It wasn't just a confession. It was a legacy of disappointment, of broken hope, of silent collapse beneath the velvet crown. And Anne, the daughter who had never failed her, was now being asked to hold it all, not with bitterness, but with purpose. The Queen didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply looked into Anne's eyes with something she had never shown before: vulnerability. And that, more than anything, was what devastated Anne the most. Not the regret, not the confusion, but the raw, human sorrow of a mother who saw her throne as a cage and her choices as chains. And with that final burden, Anne was left not just with grief, but with a mission. One that would ignite fires across the royal landscape. Anne didn't want to speak, but when she finally tried, the palace didn't just push back, they moved to silence her. Why? What were they so afraid the world would hear? In the days that followed the Queen's passing, a strange tension hung in the air, thick, unspoken, and volatile. Public mourning swept across the nation, but behind the palace gates, a different storm was unfolding. Anne, usually silent and composed, felt the weight of her mother's final words pressing against her chest like a sealed vault aching to burst open. She wasn't trying to make a scene. She wasn't seeking attention. All she wanted was to honor the Queen's dying wish, tell them what matters. And so, she tried. Quietly, carefully. A few words drafted for a tribute, a subtle reference in a scheduled interview. But each attempt was intercepted, watered down, edited without her consent. Messages from the palace comms team arrived laced with euphemisms and polite threats. We believe it's best to maintain a unified front. The focus must remain on continuity, not controversy. In other words, say nothing real. It didn't take long for Anne to realize what was happening. Her truth, the one she had buried for the sake of protocol, was being erased before it could ever reach the light. And the resistance wasn't passive. It was coordinated. Behind closed doors, palace advisors were scrambling. They feared that Anne's words, even delicately phrased, would raise dangerous questions about the Queen's regrets, about the succession, about the uneasy future they were now charged with protecting. And at the center of that unease stood one man, Charles, the new king, the son who was supposed to carry the legacy forward without fracture. But Anne's mere presence, her proximity to the Queen's final confession, cast a long shadow over his early days on the throne. Camilla, too, grew unsettled. Her carefully curated public transformation from mistress to consort was built on delicate scaffolding. Any suggestion of division within the royal bloodline threatened to undo years of rehabilitation. And Anne? She was becoming a problem, not because she spoke loudly, but because when she did speak, the truth trembled underneath it. Leaks from within the staff began to spread. One aide reportedly overheard a senior advisor snap, "She needs to remember her place." Another said Anne was warned she was jeopardizing the monarchy's stability. It was a chilling irony. After a lifetime of loyalty, she was being treated like a traitor for trying to carry out her mother's final wish. But Anne's frustration wasn't driven by personal pride. It was deeper, more visceral. She could feel the truth slipping through her fingers as the institution she had always served now moved to suffocate it. She was being pushed aside, meetings delayed, public appearances minimized. She wasn't banished, but she was being erased. And yet, she didn't erupt. She didn't rebel. She watched. She waited. Because somewhere inside her, she knew something was coming. The Queen's words hadn't been meant to stay hidden forever. They were seeds. And seeds, once planted, always find a way to grow. And yet, silence wasn't sustainable, not when the ghosts of the Queen's last words began surfacing in unexpected ways. They were siblings, yes, but rivals too. And when Anne hinted at truths Charles wanted buried, decades of sibling tension detonated in a war of icy glances and whispered threats. It began with a single interview. Anne had been cautious, as always measured in her words, controlled in her expression. When asked about her mother's passing, she paused just long enough before saying, "Some truths were shared in those final moments, truths that don't sit well with everyone." The line was barely a sentence, yet it detonated like a bomb inside the palace walls. Because for Charles, it wasn't a vague statement, it was a direct threat, a reminder that someone else had been in the room when the Queen spoke her final words. Someone who might know things he desperately needed to stay hidden. And for a man who had waited his entire life to wear the crown, that kind of uncertainty was intolerable. Old tensions, long buried beneath royal protocol, clawed their way back into the open. Their childhood had never been simple. Charles, the sensitive heir under pressure, sculpted for kingship, but often shielded and indulged. Anne, the second-born, expected to serve, not shine. She had never resented him publicly, but the palace had always treated them differently. And now, after all those years of silent endurance, the balance had shifted. Anne held a truth that could haunt his reign, and she wasn't afraid to let the world know she had it. Behind closed doors, confrontations became unavoidable. Charles demanded clarity. Anne refused. She would not elaborate, but she would not retract either. When asked privately to attend an upcoming event alongside Camilla, Anne declined without explanation. It was a bold and deliberate message. She wasn't here to play the game anymore. In quiet meetings, Charles grew cold. Anne remained stone-faced. The space between them widened. For the first time in decades, the monarchy wasn't just facing external threats, it was fracturing from within. Courtiers whispered that Charles began referring to Anne as the princess problem, a term once used to describe Diana in the press. Only this time, the threat wasn't romantic scandal. It was truth. What terrified Charles most was not what Anne might say, but what people might begin to believe if she kept saying just enough. The monarchy had weathered divorce, disgrace, and even death, but this was different. This was a fissure born not from tabloid chaos, but from within the Queen's own bloodline. A legacy of control was now hanging by a thread, not because of rebellion, but because of honesty. And Anne, though surrounded by silence, had already drawn her line in the sand. But Anne wasn't alone in this quiet rebellion, and one surprising royal was about to step forward with their own damning revelation. Caught between his father and his aunt, Prince William saw the monarchy's future hanging by a thread. Would he defend the crown or honour the Queen's dying confession? William had always walked the tightrope with practiced grace, groomed for leadership, tempered by tragedy. He had come to represent the best hope for the monarchy's survival. But as whispers of Anne's veiled defiance began to echo through the palace halls, William was faced with a dilemma he could neither ignore nor escape. He had loved his grandmother deeply. Her counsel had shaped him, steadied him, and in many ways, prepared him for what lay ahead. But now, for the first time, he was hearing that her final moments may have been far more complex and far more revealing than anyone had let on. And at the center of it stood Anne, stoic but burning with a conviction that refused to die quietly. The meeting happened in private. No aides, no agenda. Just William and Anne, behind the walls of Windsor. What was said in that room has never been officially confirmed, but the change in William afterward was undeniable. According to sources close to the palace, Anne didn't push him to choose sides. She simply gave him something to carry part of the Queen's final request. Not a command, but a charge. A reminder that while thrones are inherited, trust is earned. And trust, once broken, can bring empires to their knees. William listened, quiet, still, torn, because what Anne offered him wasn't political, it was personal. A chance to carry on not just the Queen's legacy, but her conscience. What followed was a shift so subtle it nearly escaped notice. But those watching closely saw it. In speeches that once felt ceremonial, William's tone became more grounded, more resolute. He spoke of truth, of service, of earning public faith, not assuming it. Behind closed doors, his relationship with Charles became strained, not explosive, but colder. Reports leaked that William had reached out to Harry in a rare, unpublicized call, an attempt to gauge the pulse outside the palace bubble. Whether that bridge was mended or merely tested remains unclear, but it was a signal that William was thinking beyond succession. He was thinking about survival. The crown, for William, was never about grandeur. It was about duty. But now, that duty was colliding with a legacy of secrets that demanded resolution. He wasn't naive. He knew that acknowledging Anne's truth could destabilize the fragile unity his father was trying to preserve. Yet he also knew that burying it could rot the institution from the inside out. And so, he tried to walk the line, to balance allegiance and authenticity. But in doing so, he opened a crack in the palace's pristine facade. A crack that another royal one, far less restrained, was about to shatter wide open. But even as William tried to walk the line, another royal had no such reservations, and she was about to turn Anne's silence into a national reckoning. It started with a single article, buried deep in a Sunday tabloid. But within hours, it became the story of the year. Who leaked Anne's secret, and why? The headline was innocuous at first glance. A princess's private grief. But buried within the paragraphs was dynamite, direct excerpts from what appeared to be Anne's personal reflections, handwritten, dated, and heartbreakingly intimate. The quotes weren't vague. They were specific. One line, in particular, lit the fuse. She told me the crown had chosen wrong, and it would cost us all. Within minutes, the palace phones were ringing. Advisors scrambled. Leak wasn't a rumor, it was a revelation. And worse, it carried the unmistakable voice of someone who had been in the Queen's room when the monarchy's final confession was made. The article credited no source, but whispers quickly turned into speculation. Some pointed to Zara Tindall, Anne's daughter, known for her warmth, discretion, and frustration with the palace's cold politics. Others blamed Meghan Markle, a convenient scapegoat with motive and media reach. The Queen's most sacred moment, her final reckoning, was now public knowledge, and it was laced with sorrow, regret, and damning ambiguity. The world, still tender from the Queen's passing, was now forced to confront the idea that her legacy wasn't only unfinished, it might be broken. Mourning turned to outrage. Was the Queen manipulated in her final hours? Had the palace silenced Anne out of fear, not tradition? Social media exploded. Every outlet scrambled to confirm details. Commentators dissected every word Anne had spoken publicly since the Queen's death, looking for coded language, hidden messages, signs of royal betrayal. The monarchy had weathered scandals before, but this wasn't about extramarital affairs or financial missteps. This was about truth, legacy, the whispered idea that the Queen herself, at the very end, had questioned her own choices and trusted only one daughter with that confession. The palace responded swiftly, first with silence, then with chaos. Initial statements dismissed the article as inaccurate and unauthorized. But by midweek, those same statements were quietly removed from official channels. Internal sources admitted there was no clear strategy. Too much denial would stoke the flames. Too little would look like surrender. And at the center of the storm, Anne stood firm. When asked directly, she didn't deny the diary's authenticity. She offered only one sentence. There are truths I no longer fear. It was a declaration that sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Anne had not just refused to play the palace's game, she had flipped the board, and suddenly, everything was up for question. The Queen's legacy, the King's authority, the future of the crown itself. Because if the most disciplined royal had finally chosen to speak, what else might she reveal? And who else, inside that gilded fortress? But one final twist remained, something Anne never expected. A letter from beyond the grave. Just when the world thought they knew everything, a final letter surfaced, handwritten, dated days before her death. It was from the Queen, addressed only to Anne. It was discovered quietly, folded between pages of Anne's private journal, tucked away like a relic too sacred for the world to touch. The letter bore no official seal, no royal insignia, just her mother's familiar, steady handwriting, fragile but unmistakable. For a moment, Anne couldn't move. And as she opened it, the full weight of her mother's soul seemed to spill out, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't a decree, it wasn't a confession, it was a final reckoning of legacy, love, and one last attempt to make peace with the daughter who had walked beside her, in silence, for so long. The Queen wrote of fears she never voiced aloud, fears that the institution she protected had become hollow. That in the pursuit of duty, she had lost sight of the people within the palace walls. She spoke of choices, some made out of tradition, others out of fear. But above all, she spoke of Anne. "You were always my courage," she wrote. "Not Charles, not the firm. Anne, the one who never asked for recognition. The one who never demanded more. The one who bore the weight of truth without ever letting it crack her voice." In that single line, Anne's understanding of her mother shattered and rebuilt itself in an instant. All those years of formality, of restraint, of cold ceremony, they weren't absence. They were love, repressed by the throne and disguised as tradition. Anne read the letter again and again. Each time, something deeper stirred. And then, for the first time since the funeral, she cried not out of grief but release. The words she had longed to hear, The validation she had never dared to expect had arrived not through speeches or accolades, but in quiet ink and trembling honesty. She knew immediately what had to be done. Days later, at a private family ceremony far from the cameras and chaos, Anne stood before the royal circle and read the letter aloud. Not for drama, not for vengeance, but for healing. And in that moment, the monarchy wasn't just looking backward, it was finally facing forward. The room was still as she spoke. Charles, Camilla, William, all of them listening not as royals, but as children of the woman who had finally dared to tell the truth. There were no rebuttals, no spin, just silence and the humbling acknowledgement that what had been buried needed to rise. The monarchy, for all its centuries of power, had just been redefined not by scandal, not by ceremony, but by a daughter's voice and a mother's last words. And in that raw human exchange, something shifted. Not the headlines, not the hierarchy, but the soul of the institution itself. And so, the silence was broken not with bitterness, but with grace. In her mother's final moments, Anne found not just answers, but her own voice. And in doing so, she may have saved the soul of the crown itself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.